For those who haven't met me on Monday, my name is Julia Schmack, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher, like Elisa said, at the Chair for Urban Productive Ecosystems. My background is in ecology and evolution, and so far I've predominantly worked on insects and agroecosystems for about 12 years now, and most of my research is centered around finding a compromise between agricultural food production and biodiversity conservation. And today I'm giving a talk about natural pest control and supporting natural enemies in urban and rural agriculture, with a focus on my favorite taxa. Right. Oh, sorry. Okay, so on Monday we talked about the 19 different ecosystem services, the benefits that humankind derives from ecosystems, either directly as food, like raw materials or cultural services, or indirectly as regulating and supporting ecosystem services. And one of the most important or key services for global food security is disease and pest regulation. Interestingly, there's a big difference between the research efforts between pollination and disease and pest regulation. And research suggests that it's because we like the cuddly image of pollination, like the bees and the flowers, a bit better than one predator eating another insect. Fair enough. And first of all, I'd like to emphasize that the concept of pests is a purely human-centered and not very objective classification. So imagine a zebra. It's not a pest, but a herd of zebras that would trample our crops, we would call a pest. And a pest is an animal by definition, or a plant that is harmful to humans or human concerns such as food crops, livestock, or our health. But yeah, we have to keep in mind that we've modified most landscapes and to serve our own needs. So we're growing food everywhere, we're cutting down the forest, and we don't necessarily want to share the things we're producing with other species. And that is just a reminder when we speak about pests that it's a very anthropocentric concept. Typical pests in agriculture are weeds, so plants that compete with the plants that we want to produce. Plant pathogens such as fungi, bacteria, and viruses that harm the crop or the livestock. Then we have rodents, plant-feeding insects, and mollusks that also directly compete with us because we want to eat the plants that they are chewing on the foliage or the roots of the plant. And then we have mites and nematodes, and they can be both beneficial and harmful. So some mites, like the spider mite, for instance, they mites in general have piercing, sucking mouthparts, and they pierce the epidermis of the plant and suck the plant juices. And they can damage the plant so that it dies, and we have crop losses. So the spider mite has a huge range of hundreds of plant species, and most of them are, or many of our vegetable crops fall within this. That's just an example. But there are other mites, predatory mites, that feed on these plant-sucking mites. So within this group of animals, there are both beneficial and harmful ones. Same for nematodes. These are these microscopic worm-like organisms that live in water films in the soil, and they naturally occur in the upper soil layers in an abundance that ranges from 1 to 10 millions per square meter of soil. And most of the nematodes that we have in the soils are actually beneficial because they're important for soil life, but some of them are really harmful to plants. And we have some natural pest control agents, and the typical categories are predators, so insects or animals that feed on other animals, so animals that feed on pests like herbivores, then parasites such as parasitic wasps, for instance, that kill their hosts, which are usually pests. Then we have pathogens that can help with natural pest control, and climatic events that, for instance, interrupt the reproductive cycle of pests. And since I've worked mainly on insects, the focus of this talk will be on insect pests and insect predators. Here we have a few photos of common agricultural pests. In the top left, we have an aphid, and you can see this piercing, sucking mouthpart, which it injects into the plant and damages it. Then we have butterfly or moth larvae, these caterpillars in the center, that feed on the foliage, or leaf beetles that feed on the foliage of plants. We have grubs and fly maggots, like this root maggot fly here, that live in the soil and feed on the root parts of the plant and damage it. And then we have also a lot of different invasive or introduced species that are spreading from their native ranges into their introduced range and causing damage to the crops, like this brown marmorated stink bug. And the trouble with that is that often the introduced animal doesn't have a natural enemy in this introduced range. And then when you go further and say, oh, we could introduce the enemy, the natural enemy, it becomes like a whole, then they can go wild again because they don't have an enemy. So it's a very tricky concept. But now I'd like to introduce you to a few heroes in agriculture. We have beetles, especially carabid beetles and ladybugs, predatory bugs, lacewings, and syrphid flies on this slide here. So beetles feed on aphids, mites, mealybugs, caterpillars, grubs, fly maggots, and so on. And the larger species, even like this big carabid beetle you see here, they can even feed on snails and slugs. Then in the center photo, you see a ladybug hatching out of its cocoon, and both the larvae and the adult are predatory, and they can hunt day or night. In the photo on the right, you see a true bug. They can be both plant sap feeders, or they can be predatory. And this photo here shows the predatory bug of Macrolophus genus, which is commercially used to control the whitefly, which is a very important pest in agriculture and horticulture. Right, then we see a lacewing larvae here attacking an aphid, and here it's more the larvae that's important, not so much the adult, at least for pest control. And they are very hungry. They can feed on 30 to 50 mites per hour on aphids, bugs, and caterpillars and fly larvae. And the same is true for syrphid flies. So these syrphids, they hoverflies. And it's not so much the adults, which do pollinate a lot, but the larvae are really important for pest control. And they are as well good predators for all plant-sucking pests. And some of these species, they are already used commercially, and some of them are really still understudied. Now we get to my favorite topic, wasps. So this is a parasitic wasp here. They are one of the most important biocontrol agents, and they are bred and sold around the globe for agriculture, horticulture, and private gardens. So if you Google them, you can order parasitic wasps online, for instance. This long ovipositor that you can see here, you know them from wasps and other wasps and bees as a stinger. So in social wasps and in bees, they use them as a defense, but these parasitic wasps use the ovipositor as a to lay their eggs either inside the host or on top of the host, where the hatched larvae then parasitize on the host. Right, these hosts usually live in cocoons or in leaf mines or in plant galls or in wood, for instance, and it's fascinating that the length of the ovipositor gives you an idea of where the host lives. So, these the wasps with a very long ovipositor, almost 3 or 4 times as long as their body length, they usually lay their eggs in wood or in hosts that live in wood. And apart from solitarily living parasitic wasps, we have social wasps, which have a different survival strategy. They are generalists, which means they go for whatever is there, and they're not specialized on certain prey species. They hunt other arthropods and scavenge on dead animal tissue, for instance, to feed the protein to their brood. And the adults feed on nectar, so on carbohydrate resources. And in this video, if it works, in this video here, you can see how a vespular wasp caught a fly and kills it to take it home to the nest and feed it to the young, to the larvae. So as generalist predators, wasp colonies can really substantially reduce the standing crop of herbivorous insects in farms. But unfortunately, there's not much research on this. It's not a very sexy topic because wasps have a bad image, but we will get to that later. For now, I'd like to show you this confusing illustration of a food web in sweet pepper crops that was published by Messerling et al. And I just want to illustrate or emphasize how intertwined these food webs are and how many more interactions we have to include when thinking about biological or natural pest control. So this is the plant, the sweet pepper crop, and in the bottom row, we have the different herbivores, aphids, thrips, spider mites, and whiteflies, typical agricultural pests. And then we have generalist predators here that feed, like I said, they don't really care what they're not specialized on a certain species or a certain group, but they feed on everything that's there. So this generous predator. Then we have specialist aphid enemies. There's a parasitoid here that parasites aphids. Then we have predators that prey specialized on aphids. And we have a hyperparasitoid that parasites the parasitoid of the aphid. So I'm just giving you an example of how many different levels you have to take into consideration. Then we have a specialized spider mite predator and a specialized whitefly parasitoid. And like I said, these general predators, they don't really care. So if you have general predators in the system, they might also eat the beneficial insects. Yeah, this illustration just shows that the pest-enemy interactions are embedded in rich communities and that these interactions have an effect on the efficiency of biological control. And mind that this example is from a greenhouse, which are the least complex food systems usually available. If you imagine this in a natural system, it would be much more complex. So biological pest control is not trivial, and the supposedly easy way to protect our crops is the application of pesticides. So the earliest pesticide used was elemental sulfur 4,500 years ago, and even the Romans used plant extracts and heavy metals to protect their crops and to cover or coat their seeds. In Persia, they used pyrethrum from chrysanthemum plants. That was also 400 years before Christ. And yeah, as a species or in our history, we've had multiple dramatic examples of pests that cost millions of lives. For instance, in 1840, the potato blight in Ireland called the Great Hunger, or a fungus causing the Reblaus grape phylloxera, destroying huge areas of vineyards in France. And so it's not surprising that we work really hard on diverse and efficient pesticides to ensure our species' survival. And the first inorganic chemical pesticides to protect grapes from mildew were developed in the 1880s. And later on, since the 1940s, we really started synthesizing and commercializing highly efficient broad-spectrum pesticides. One of the first ones to be marketed was DDT. I can't pronounce, I'm not going to say the word. We all know the sad story of this pesticide. It was hailed as a miracle insecticide against malaria and against certain many insect diseases, but it was also very persistent in the environment and had huge impacts on human and animal health. So it was banned in the 1970s. However, the invention of chemical pesticides was the basis of the Green Revolution and supported food security around the world. But we all know that we can't keep going with pesticides like this because we are losing our biodiversity, and pesticide use is one big reason for it. So apart from the side effects on non-target organisms like humans and other mammals, a huge problem with this broadband or broad spectrum pesticide use is that they cannot target one specific group of insects usually, but they affect the entire food web consisting of insects. So as you can see in this illustration, there's agricultural pesticide application, often by airplanes on a large scale, to protect the crops, but it goes into the soil, it goes into the plant, and gets into contact not only with the pests, but also with the pollinators, with the predators, and the parasitoids, and has lethal or sublethal effects on these beneficial organisms. Yeah, it's also if some pesticides accumulate in the plant and then accumulate in the pollen or nectar of plants. So even if it doesn't kill the insects directly, pollinators are affected by the contaminated nectar and pollen. So pesticides affect not only the target animals, but also the beneficial organisms in the system. And this often leads to a kind of vicious cycle because without natural enemies, the farmer is even more so dependent on pesticides. And another big concern is the resistance that insects develop against pesticides. And here the food web is interesting as well. So if the farmer applies pesticides, then often the beneficial insects can't react as fast as the herbivores, because the herbivores have faster reproductive cycles often, and they develop a resistance against the pesticides, but the beneficial ones often don't. And therefore they're even more affected by pesticide use. So it's clear that we need alternatives to these broad spectrum pesticides, and sustainable agriculture is trying to use as many beneficial services that natural enemies provide. So instead of applying pesticides, they promote the ecosystem service of natural pest control. But how can we promote this? We've looked at this graph already on Monday. For those who weren't there, this is the result from a meta-analysis based on 89 studies in about 1,400 different agri-ecosystems around the world. And what we found across these over 1,400 sites is that the richness of natural enemies on the x-axis is positively correlated with the provisioning of pest control on the y-axis. So the more different natural enemy species there are, the better is the control of unwanted pests. However, the majority of our agricultural systems has been simplified. So landscape simplification leads to a reduction in natural enemy richness, cascades down into their ecosystem service provisioning of pest control, and finds or results in lower productivity. So conversely, is there anything we can do or we need to change about the landscape in order to increase natural enemy richness? And in the study by Chumi et al., they found that flowering strips might be one of the answers. And he's one of many researchers that actually found a positive correlation between flower strips and natural enemies. So the 4 graphs here represent different enemies. So here you have the number of hoverflies, the number of lacewings, the number of ladybirds, and this one here is hoverfly species richness. So this is abundance and this is richness. But across all these 4 graphs, you can see that the light gray bars we can look at the light gray bars compared to the dark gray bars. The light gray stands for the flower strips and the dark gray for the control fields. And in 6 out of 8 cases, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and where you see the little asterisks, this stands for significant difference. So in 6 out of 8 cases, the abundance of natural enemies was significantly higher in the flower strips than in control fields. When we then look at the number of aphid pests, we can see that that they are significantly lower in flower strip fields than in control fields. Whoopsie. Yeah. So not only flowering strips, but also ground cover, adjacent vegetation, especially trees, have been found to increase natural enemy diversity and pest control services. And the good thing is that you have, most bang for your buck, so to say, if you have these flowering strips, because you support both regulating services, pollination and pest control. If there's one place where spraying pesticides is really a bad idea, that's in densely populated cities, such as Munich in the photo here. And by 2050, 67% of the world's population is forecasted to live in cities. Cities hold a huge potential for growing food, but they also decrease a lot of biodiversity in the surrounding landscapes. So especially for urban agriculture, which is forecasted to increase, natural pest control has an immense potential to combine crop protection and biodiversity conservation as well. And there's one group of insect that, to my knowledge, is largely misunderstood and maybe a hero of urban agriculture sometime, which are social wasps. So as I showed you in the beginning, they are generalist predators and feed on a variety of insect taxa. As you can see with this Polistes here, it's very hard to tell what she's eating, but it's an insect. And they're also very ubiquitous in the cities. So you've heard of the news that wasps are everywhere and so on. But if they're everywhere, we might as well use them for food production. Here you can see the nests of a Polistes species on the left and Vespula on the right. And for my PhD on social wasps, I developed a diet analysis using DNA metabar coding of the fecal samples in the nests. The fecal samples, you can see here, these black dots, and here, up here. So the little drawing to show you how this works. Let's start with the adult wasp. Can you actually see my cursor, my mouse cursor? Yeah, cool. Okay, here's the adult wasp, and she is hunting insect prey, like this caterpillar here, chewing it up into a ball and bringing it back to the nest, which is zoomed in here. And here you can see the larvae, which is hanging in the cell. The larvae is fed with the caterpillar, and the adult wasp flies back, gets some other stuff, some other insects from everywhere, and feeds the larvae. So this larvae stays in the cell and defecates into the bottom of the cell, which is actually the ceiling. And it does that for about, so the development of the larvae is 28 to 48 days from egg to adult. So for a certain time, they defecate into the bottom of the cell, and they also reuse these cells. So in this little ball down here, you have the prey DNA of all the different prey insects that were collected over this time. And here's an impression of an inactive nest that we collected last year from Munich. Oh, sorry. I'd like to. I'm opening the paper envelope that covers the different layers of brood cells, and yeah, you can see these pancake like layers inside. Okay. And each of this envelope is built by thousands of workers, and they chew up the woody material and stick it onto the envelope. So it's a lot of beautiful work. And from these nests, I extract the fecal samples and then use those to extract the DNA of all prey species that were fed to the larvae over the entire season. And traditionally, this method, or traditionally finding out what they fed on, the wasps, you'd have to stay in front of the nest and then capture single forages and morphologically determine what they brought home. And you can see this brown ball here. It's very hard to see what kind of insect this is. Also, this, even if you would do DNA analysis, it would be a snapshot in time. So you'd know, okay, it's a caterpillar of this species. But with the method that we developed for my PhD, we get an inventory or like a list of prey species over the entire season. And this we could use to determine the proportion of insects that are beneficial in agriculture and those that are harmful in agriculture, and then decide whether they have the potential, whether wasps have the potential to be used in agriculture pest control. And I don't want to go into too much detail with the results here in this figure, but there are 4 different panels. They stand for 4 different wasp species that were part of this study. And you can see on the x-axis there are the different insect or arthropod orders. And the bars denote the extent or the percentage of this order to the total diet. And what I want you to take away from this graph or figure is that Lepidoptera, Diptera, and Hemiptera, so butterflies and moths, flies, and bugs, were the most common prey items in wasps' diet. And these three orders also contain most agricultural pest species. That's why I think that wasps have the potential to serve as natural pest control agents in agriculture, and particularly in urban agriculture where we can't use pesticides. We don't want to use pesticides. So last year we collected over 60 inactive nests in our network of 30 urban community gardens in Berlin and Munich. And I am really looking forward to analyzing the results and to share them with you in the future. And there have been experimental studies on the efficiency of pest control by social wasps in other countries like Brazil. In the left photo, you see artificial shelters, which were used in a study by Presotto et al. Great paper, I recommend it. In this study, they also show that wasps significantly reduce the standing crop of pest insects by 19 to 95% of the prey was made up of leaf-eating caterpillars and dipterans that often also serve as vectors for diseases. In this study, they also conclude that or highlight the practicality of this method. And I think I agree that, yeah, it's practical, even though it doesn't sound like it, because usually people don't want to be in touch or too close to wasp nests, but some species are, like Polistes, are not as aggressive as Vespula, for instance. Low operational costs, also, yeah, an advantage in other countries. The absence of prey resistance, so we don't have pesticide resistance and we don't have to use as many insecticides. And there's another study by Southon et al., also a great paper, that demonstrates the reduced crop damage. So not just the standing crop of insects, but also crop damage on the plant itself when wasps had access to the plants. So this is the wasp-exposed treatment of plants. And this is where wasps were excluded, and there's a significant difference in the damage. Yeah. They don't only provide pest control, they also pollinate a whole lot of different plant species or plant families. As you can see in this figure here from a paper by Brock et al., where they're looking at the ecosystem services of aculeate wasps. And in the green boxes, you see the different plant families, quite a lot. In the white boxes, you see different wasp families. And in the center of all this figure here, you see Vespidae, so which are those wasps that we particularly dislike often because they like our food, our cakes and our picnics. And you can see that they have a lot of connections, a lot of different connections, or most connections actually, to different plant families. So they're important pollinators. And in agricultural systems that are especially intensified, wasps have been found to serve as backup pollinators. So even when wild bees and bees can't fly anymore, wasps can still do like a backup service of pollination. And it doesn't end here. They don't just pollinate and control pests, but they also disperse seeds, are important for decomposition. So we have regulating services, pest control, pollination, population regulation, and supporting services such as seed dispersal, decomposition. We have provisioning services, nutrition, and biomedical. One example for biomedical service is the species of wasp found in Brazil. It's called Polybia paulista. Has a venom or a toxin that can eliminate cancer cells, and I think there's a lot more there's a lot more potential in wasp venom and also in the fungi they kind of farm. Then we have cultural services, bioindicators, culture, and recreation. And one point that I'd like to make as well is that with generalist predators, or with analyzing generalist predator species, we might also be able to develop non-invasive biomonitoring tools, because they are generalists, they feed on what's there. And so if we look at their feces, we might find an overview of the biodiversity that's present in a system. One last fun fact to maybe improve your image of wasps a little bit. So if you feed wasps colorful fiber, they will create colorful, beautiful nests like this. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And again, thanks to my team, Urban Productive Ecosystems, and to many colleagues, supervisors, and funding organizations that enabled my research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for this interesting talk. I don't know, every time I see one of your lectures, my ideas of wasps are like rainbows. They're like magical heroes. I hope the people who are attending have also changed a little bit their negative views of wasps and realize how beneficial they can be. I would like to ask anyone who would like to ask questions to write them down in the chat or on our sheet, a Google Sheet. We have already one question. It says, what is the alternative to pesticides? Is it biopesticides or something else? I think maybe could you perhaps say in a couple of sentences again what you're proposing as an alternative to pesticides, Julia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm not an expert on pesticides per se. I'm focusing on natural pest control, but I think there are a lot of movements towards integrated pest management, for instance, to make it a bit better on a larger scale. So to use biopesticides, for instance, and like I said, as humans, we've used plant extracts from the beginning, basically. It's just that the synthetical pesticides are really harmful, but it's not that the natural pesticides are not harmful to insects, because otherwise they wouldn't work. But I guess it's more a question of using specific pesticides, so not the broadband spectrum pesticides, to at least maintain the biodiversity of the generalist predators or the beneficial insects. Yeah, sorry, I can't. As I said, I'm not an expert on pesticides.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. We have another question in the chat here. It's about ticks. I don't know if that's also you're familiar with that, but it says, can you comment on the advisability of permethrin as a control agent, especially for ticks and people who spend a lot of time in the woods for foraging? Marjorie says that she's heard a lot that it's a lot better than alternatives, but she's skeptical about it.
Oh, so permethrin, she asked.
Yeah.
I think it's
permethrin. I'm not sure.
So from chrysanthemum, permethrin, like
yes.
Marjorie, yeah, I'd like to.
Well, I think it should be efficient because it's an insecticide. So permethrin works against insects. I mean, ticks are not insects; they belong to spiders, so to say. But I think it would work. I don't know the answer exactly, but I can imagine that it works. Sorry.
I was just thinking, because it's broad spectrum, would you say, is it, not good to use it because it would kill too many other things? But the problem is, ticks are becoming a very big problem with transmitting, serious diseases. So I just wanted to get your opinion about that.
Yeah, I'm not certain. I've struggled with tick bites and diseases, and I understand that we want to get rid of them or want to keep them in check. But on the other hand, I'm in two minds about this. It's a dilemma, but on the other hand, I feel like as humans we shape the world so much so that it's nice for us, I guess. Yeah, it's a difficult question. I can't really answer this. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks.
Do we have any more questions? If you do, feel free to write them in the chat or just connect your microphone and ask them directly to Julia.
If possible, I would like to ask my question. So you mentioned about diversity of biocontrol agents in greenhouses. And because I am planning my work linked to establishing a diversified cropping system in the greenhouses, including for to improve like retention or activity of these biocontrol agents, could you maybe please also give your suggestions, like what would be feasible in the greenhouse settings in general to improve the efficiency of biological pest control? I presume that you meant rare biocontrol agents, or maybe I don't know. And what could be feasible in terms of crop diversity?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So two levels of question. I think the typical biocontrol agents that you can order, for instance, would make sense because it's a greenhouse, it's a controlled environment. So we here at TUM, we, for instance, use parasitic wasps often. You could use lacewings, for instance, or syrphid flies. I'm not sure if they're actually commercially produced, though. You'd have to check on this. But these are, yeah, with these, you know that they are really targeting the herbivores. So probably until you know that a generalist predator is really, yeah, beneficial, like the wasps, for instance, I would wait and go for the lower level where you know they attack the herbivores in the greenhouse, because you can, yeah, as I said, you can control the environment. And for plant diversity, I don't really have any experience with plant diversity in greenhouses. Like I said in the last talk, we have such little literature on this. It's usually from agricultural fields, or in the greenhouse, it's more like the horticultural productivity that is tested, but we're really lacking studies. So I think if you would study that in the greenhouse as well, it would be a huge contribution. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you, Pavla, for your question. Do we have any other questions? Anyone?
Okay, then while we are waiting, maybe I can ask the second question. That you showed the slides on the efficiency of flower strips for the number of pest predators and also on the number of aphids. And in most cases, the strips worked to improve the number of pest predators, but in some cases they failed. And also, like you showed that the amount of aphids decreased. So like the question is, in which situation the florist strips failed, and do you have an explanation why? And was the situation with pest control similarly efficient despite the effect on the number of pest predators, or was it also correlated?
Can you repeat the last part of the question?
Because like you showed only one graph or in terms of aphids that flower strips decrease it. So was it in all observations, or was it the average data?
I think it was the average data. The average data, and I don't really, maybe I can post the paper on the chat, and we can look. I guess they explain why, where it failed or why it failed. I can also go back. Sorry, this is gonna here. Go. So where it failed was in the potato crop field, and it was for ladybirds, and then here for hoverflies. No, it was a little bit higher, but non-significant. But here, actually, in the control fields, the number of ladybirds or ladybugs was higher. I guess, I mean, it's not a controlled area, so there could have been other predators that particularly like ladybugs. And I wonder, well, one reason that I could think of from the top of my head is that ladybirds are easier to catch, for instance, by birds. There's such a complex system, so this is one explanation. Then hoverflies, for instance, because they're super fast. Yeah, but I will post the paper by Jumi et al. On the chat. Okay. Thank you for the interesting questions. Cheers.
Great, a lovely conversation. I don't see any more questions either in the sheet or on the chat. If anyone would like to ask directly, please go ahead. Otherwise, I guess we can close the session already.
So actually, there is, I don't know if the previous presenter is still with us, because there was also a comment on this Osmia competition. So in fact, the question was not about the competition, but about attack of Osmia bees on honeybees.
Alejandra, are you? Yeah, you're here.
I'm still here. I was actually Googling if this was something in the newspapers or not. No, the direct attack, I wouldn't think so. So based on there's different osmias and they have different times where they are flying, but I wouldn't think that they are indirect attack of perhaps, I mean, in order to annihilate a honeybee, a beehive, you need to go for the queen. I don't really see that situation where a solitary small bee like an osmia would like really pose a physical threat to the queen of a honeybee that is heavily protected and normally just inside in the very center of the honeybee. I wouldn't know. I was also Googling, maybe this is something that they also post for wild honeybees. Maybe they saw that in wild honeybees rather than in managed honeybee, and there perhaps the queen is a bit more exposed, but I don't really think so. That's in terms of resource competition, I would actually think that there might be an overlap in plants, and normally the osmia would be in disadvantage because of the bare number that there are, the nesting sites and so on. But thank you for going back. Yes, I was Googling if there's something in the news about
That is interesting.
killer
Indeed.
osmias or something like this.
And
Yes,
I saw that
can-
just before we started like this presentation, Halina raised her hand, so maybe she also had some question to you. Okay, maybe not.
I will say, can I say one thing on that comment that there are some wild bees, and maybe Astrid Neumann, who is also in the room, can also confirm this. But yes, some wild bees do kind of attack the honeybees, or yeah, they fight with them for floral resources. But I would agree with what Ale said. But certainly in nature and in agricultural landscapes as well. Yeah, bees are fighting, both wild and honeybees are fighting for resources. So they coexist and use resources, but they also, to an extent, compete with one another. So yeah, we see often that some bees wild bees will push honeybees off of flowers, which is a funny sight to watch. And also some spiders will, catch honeybees in their webs and have a very delicious breakfast of honeybees.
All right, thank you everyone for your comments and for your questions. Oh, we have someone, Alexander, commenting that he has an apiary and he personally saw wasps attacking beehives. I think that also maybe confirms what Monika was saying, that they compete. They're in nature, natural. They compete for resources. But we are out of time right now. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Julia, for your presentation. Thank you, Alejandra, for your input. And thank you, everyone who asked questions. I will give the floor now to Pavlo if we want to give
Я
any
вибачаюсь.
instructions now. Or wait, I think someone wants to say
I'm
something.
sorry, yes.
У мене є доповнення. Можна? Да.
I have something to add, if possible, for this question regarding competition between wasps and the bees. In my practice, in my experience, there was a research when beekeepers by chance leave honey nearby a beehive or spill it somehow, they provoke wasps. So they provoke wasps attacks on the bee family. This is the main reason why wasps would attack honeybees, because they smell honey. If there is no honey smell around the beehive, this provocation of any attacks is not going to work. Thank you.